I was in my senior year of high school about 10 years ago. I grew up as sort of an outcast in high school. I wasn't bullied or anything, but I also didn't really have any friends. I didn't mind that solitary lifestyle, though. I went through school and then would come home and play video games, and losing myself in those digital worlds was my escape. My home life wasn't what I would call bad either. It was just my dad and me, and I love my dad. He worked so much to provide for me. When I was young, maybe 10 or 11 years old, my mom got involved with some bad people and their hobbies, if you know what I mean. My dad didn't want to expose me to that world anymore, and we eventually moved away. It was messy, but it was for the best. He tried getting her help throughout the years, but she always turned it down, until one day she was just off the grid completely. It was sad, but we both moved on, and when I got older, he would have to leave for the weekend once a month for his job. I didn't mind, though. It may seem crazy to some people to leave someone at that age home alone for a weekend, but my dad trusted me. One specific weekend during senior year, when my dad left for the night, I started my normal routine. My pops would leave me some money to order a pizza and some soda. We never had soda in the house, so getting this 2-liter with the pizza was like a double treat for me. My night was beginning to play out just like every other night that I was home alone. I demolished the pizza and drank most of the soda. After a little breather on the couch, I went to my room and started playing some PlayStation. This is how I would spend most of my weekends, even if Dad was home. I would usually play Call of Duty, but Grand Theft Auto Online had just come out, so I had been spending some time playing that. After a few hours of that, I decided to play the single-player story mode. The older I got, I seemed to play the story in games less, but for some reason on this night, I wanted to play something with some substance, even if it was GTA. Since I wasn't playing online anymore, I took my headphones off. As much as I game, I hate wearing headphones for long periods of time. I had been playing the story for a little while I thought that I could hear something coming from downstairs. There weren't any loud or jarring noises. It was just these small little vibrations and little bumps. Now, I had been home alone a ton of times, and I didn't remember ever feeling any of those vibrations or hearing any noises like that. But at the same time, the noises weren't alarming enough that I was actually freaked out. It was a little after 1 a.m, and I think it's just subconscious to be a little on edge when you're home alone at that hour. Every few moments, I would hear a little scuffing noise. I paused the game and tried to listen intently. When I listened, I would mostly just hear silence and maybe an occasional little bump. Just because I was home alone, of course, the quick thought of an intruder crossed my mind. I'm even embarrassed to say that at one point I even thought to myself, are ghosts real? But then I would immediately shoot the idea down. This little internal debate would continue for about 30 minutes. I finally paused the game and went over and sat in my computer chair to just listen for a few minutes without trying to listen over the sound of gameplay. The sounds started to happen more regularly. The sounds of the little bumps that I initially blamed on creaking pipes or house noises started to happen more often. The little vibrations I could feel were now happening almost every second. It was like my dad might be downstairs. The only thing missing was hearing his voice, though. The thought of my dad coming home early even crossed my mind, but he would have called me or at least poked his head in the room to see if I was awake. I decided that I was just being paranoid and that I was getting myself all worked up for nothing. I decided I was going to go downstairs and check it out to prove to myself that nobody was in the house, and that I was clearly just letting my imagination run away from me. As the night ran on, I crept slowly down the upstairs hall and made my way to the top of the staircase. While I was slowly heading in the direction, the muffled sounds were much louder, and I started fearing the worst. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind right away, but I was actually too anxious in that moment. In my mind, I was thinking to myself, what if nobody's here, and I just waste the police's time? When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I saw a light illuminating the dark walls coming from the other side of the house. It was the kitchen light. It's possible I left it on, but I'm fairly compulsive, and I was nearly 100% certain that I had shut the light off before heading upstairs. I was practically crawling to the kitchen. I was moving so slowly. When I was only a few feet away from the kitchen doorway, I could hear the sounds of rummaging, like someone was going through my cabinets in the kitchen. That was accompanied by a soft humming voice, and that hum, it was so eerie. I was half expecting to see some big scary burglar, but the voice indicated something else. I peeked my head into the kitchen, and in the corner next to the sink was a very small woman. Her hair was wild, kind of flowing in every direction. I had my phone in my hand ready to call the police, but I think that situation just had me frozen in terror, but also incredibly curious. Then I realized the melody the woman was singing. She was humming "I've Got No Strings" from the Disney Pinocchio movie, and I almost fainted right there because I knew who this person was. It was my mom. She would always sing that to me when I was very young, and it was one of the only memories of my mother that I actually had left. I couldn't move, and I must have been trembling because she had heard me. Turning around, a big smile lit up her face. Even though it was my mom, this was not the mother that I remembered. Her teeth looked rotten, and her eyes looked like they were sunken into her face. The voice that should have been soothing was somehow unnerving. She said, "There's my baby. What are you doing awake at this hour?" I didn't respond. I just stood there like some statue. She came over to me and put her dirty hand on my shoulder, saying, "What am I going to do with your father? He's always changing out cabinets around. I swear that man doesn't listen." And then she started to laugh, but it wasn't charming. It was like some disgusting cartoon character laughing. She turned back around and started humming and going through the cabinets again. I broke out of my trance and went to my room and locked the door. I then called the police and my dad right away. My dad made sure that I was in the bedroom with the door locked. He didn't go into details, but he said that there was a chance my mother might be dangerous, and I needed to be safe just in case. The cops showed up, and I heard a minor altercation. I could hear my mom yelling at the police to get out of her house. The police knew the situation from myself and my dad, who called after me, and I heard a brief struggle and then silence. For a few moments, I heard a cop shout my name and told me it was all right for me to come downstairs. I spoke with the police for a little while as another officer drove my mother away. One officer stayed parked outside of my house all night until my dad came home, just to help me feel safer, which I do really appreciate. My dad came home early the next morning, and he spoke with one of the officers. I could tell by reading my dad's body language that he was uncomfortable and that we were potentially fortunate to avoid something horrible happening. My mother actually had 2 knives on her when she was apprehended. One knife she must have had when she broke in, and the other knife was a sharp kitchen knife that belonged to my dad. She must have stuck it in her pocket when she was in the kitchen. She never used them or even threatened to use them, but the fact that she had them was enough to freak me out. But maybe the most terrifying part of this horrible nightmare was that my mother had no idea where we lived. Well, she wasn't supposed to have any idea. When we moved away, we moved far away, and my dad never told my mom where we moved to protect me. She broke into the house by breaking one of the downstairs windows and crawling in. I didn't hear it at all, so it must have been when I had my headphones on or something. And I thought of my mom just humming and walking around downstairs, potentially waiting for my dad while I was upstairs, and it still freaks me out to this day. It's been about 10 years now, and I've only seen my mother twice since that night. She has been in some type of institution for years now. She has no memory of that night, but in all fairness, she doesn't have much memory of anything at all. It's sad, but it's true. Every time I hear that stupid song from Pinocchio now, I sort of freeze up, and I just hope one day I can forget about the fear that I felt that night and find a way to remember my mom in a positive light. A few years back, I got a call from a private number. I don't usually answer those kinds of calls, but I was expecting one from my local tax office. I was told that they call from some sort of private number. I answered the phone, and it's not the tax woman. It's some kid saying, "Hello, Dad. When are you coming home?" The line was terrible, and I could barely hear the little guy, so I had to ask him to repeat himself before finally saying, "Sorry, man, I'm not your dad." I think he got the wrong number. The only thing was the voice sounded weirdly familiar. So, my first thought is that it was a second cousin or one of my friend's kids getting the wrong number or something. It was only a little while later that I realized who it was on the other end. It was me, the night my dad took his own life. I called him and asked him the exact same thing. They told me he'd be home in the next few hours, but he never came home again. I can't explain how or why it happened. I just sank my head into my hands and cried. I've never told anyone this story, but I'll tell you because I suppose it doesn't matter either way. You don't know me, I don't know you. And if we did meet, you'd never know it. But it happened, and I know it must have happened to other people too. I just wonder how many and if it'll ever be properly explained. When I was 14 years old, I went to a church gathering on a Halloween night. It was called Hallelujah Night, a Christian alternative to Halloween. My family and I would get there in the afternoon since we'd volunteer to help set up the booths, including cakewalk, candy barrels, etc. But I was mostly there to get first dibs on all the candy. After I finished helping with the usual booth setup, I took a seat on a bench near the main sanctuary. It was my favorite place to sit since I could see the entire lot and, most of all, the beautiful sunset. I pulled out my PSP and was scrolling through some music I had on it when some guy approached me and started a conversation. I've never been a people person, so usually when things like this happen, I keep the conversation short. However, this guy had this weird type of warmth to him, as if he was a friend of mine. As the conversation carried on, I started to ask him if he was new because I hadn't seen him before. He told me that he had been going to this church for years, but left after an incident happened. When I asked him about the incident, he paused, looked at me, and said that there are some things people pick up on that they know aren't normal, and that you should never get curious about things that you know you should leave alone. I had a sort of confused look on my face since I didn't know what he meant at that time. The guy noticed it and said that I would understand once I got older. I looked down at my PSP that I had in my hand still and looked back up, and the guy was gone. I looked around and couldn't find him anywhere in the lot, except for a few people still prepping for Hallelujah night. It didn't make any sense. Forward to a few months later, I was sitting in the main sanctuary before leaving to do my usual volunteer work on the upper floor of the main sanctuary. The upper floor was a daycare area for kids, so at the end of the service, volunteers would escort the children downstairs, and I would go into each room, shutting off the lights and making sure no children were still up there. I'll never forget getting to leave to do my usual duties when the pastor started talking about an upcoming funeral. I looked at the big screens on each side of the main sanctuary, and the face of the man I was talking to during Hallelujah night was there. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. To this day, it still seems unreal. I was beyond shook as I made my way out of the main sanctuary into the flights of big stairs. As I went to the upper floor, another volunteer had confirmed that all the children were escorted downstairs. She noticed that I had looked sort of pale from seeing what I saw in the main sanctuary and asked me if I was okay. I told her it was nothing and proceeded to cut off all the lights on the upper floor. As she left downstairs, the upper floor was like a giant hallway with doors on each side and a door at the end of the hallway with a giant window in it. When I came to the last room at the end of the hall, I would always leave the blinds on that big window open since the light always illuminated the dark hallway and made me feel less scared. But as I left the room, I remember feeling panicked. It started freezing, and I felt like if I left that room, something was waiting for me in the darkened rooms and was going to jump out and attack me. As I'm trying to muster up the courage to just run for it, I see a small head of a child peek out a couple of doors down. It stayed there for a few seconds and then put its head back in the room. I immediately called out to the child, but there was no answer. The fear I had added minutes ago was gone as I left the last room to go through the illuminated hallway. I made it to the other room in a matter of seconds, cutting on the lights and searching the entire room for the child I saw, but no one was there. I started getting spooked again as I cut off the lights in that room. Then, one of the most terrifying things I'd ever seen and experienced happened. As I was leaving the room, I looked back at the last room's window, which illuminated the hallway, and out of nowhere, I saw a massive black mass move in front of the window, almost covering the light completely. It was darker than black, and its outline as it covered the light seemed to be moving. It was enough to scare me to run for my life. I ran through the rest of the hallway and down the stairs. I was stopped by one of the ushers who told me not to run. But when I told him what I saw, he looked at me as if I was crazy. Once the church service was over, I told my parents about what happened on the ride home, and they ended up not believing me since they're skeptics. But I know what I saw that day, and it's something that still scares me to this very day. Alone, let me first say that this story is a little depressing, and it makes me feel sad writing it. But it doesn't change the fact that this was one of the most frightening nights of my entire life. My father passed away when I was 4 or 5 years old. My mom met David when I was 10 years old, and he ended up adopting me several years later. Even though David wasn't my real father, he raised me as if though I was his own daughter, and I loved him like he was my real dad. Scratch that, I hate the phrase real dad. That man wasn't like a real father. He was my father. He was a great man, and he treated my mother and me like we were the most important things in the world. A few months back, David passed away. He got sick suddenly and died not long after. It was sad, and it hit my mom really hard. He was old, but it didn't hurt any less. My elderly mother was already declining in her health, and we were worried that this may be the final straw that broke her back. A few nights after the funeral, Mom would call me in the middle of the night. Every time I thought, oh no, and figured the worst. It was bad, but not the type of bad that I thought. She was terrified. 2 nights in a row, she called and claimed that someone was in her house. She could hear them moving around, and she was incredibly scared. My husband and I felt horrible. On both days, we went over and searched the entire house and found nothing out of place. It didn't look like anybody broke in. Nothing was stolen, and we triple-checked that everything was locked up tight. On the 3rd day, my mom begged me to stay overnight. This was if the intruders showed up again. I could witness and either stop them or call the police or something. Honestly, I just thought my mom was really tired and was dreaming and thinking her dreams were real or something. At some point during the night, I thought that I heard someone or something coming from the dining room. It was jarring because it was clearly a voice. For a single second, I thought my mom was right and people were breaking into the home. I slowly got off the couch and started to head toward the noise. I rolled out ghosts because I'm not really into any of that, and I started to think that maybe it was someone homeless or something, and they were squatting inside this elderly person's home. All these ideas were running through my head a million miles per hour as I was drawing closer to the noise. When I was only 1 room away, I could clearly hear the voice. It was my mom. I stopped sneaking at that point and walked into the dining room. My mom was sitting at the head of the table and having a full-blown conversation with nobody. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. Her eyes were wide open, but they were almost glazed over. She was awake and asleep, and she never looked in my direction. But she knew that I walked in. In a cheerful voice, she said, "Hello, dear. I'm just enjoying some time with David." I looked over, and the chair next to her was slightly pulled out, like my mom pulled it out for someone to sit in. I got closer to my mom, and her eyes were even more disturbing. It was like I could only see the white parts of her eyes, and mixed that with her smiling and talking, and it was incredibly creepy. I tried to gently tell my mother that David passed away, and she just laughed and waved her hand in my face and said, "You're so silly. David's sitting right here." I was at a loss for words. I didn't know the correct way to handle this. Do I just make my grieving and elderly mother happy and let her think that she's talking to her dead husband? Or do I try and wrangle her way back to reality and her crushing heartbreak? She grabbed my hand and, still not looking in my direction or changing her facial features, she said to me, "You can leave now, sweetie." I don't know why I was so scared. It was just David cleaning the house that I heard last night. It was just David. It was just David. I remember it word for word. She kept repeating that last part. The sleep talking turned into gibberish, and then every once in a while, I would hear the name David slip out of her mouth. I didn't realize until that night just how hard my mother took the loss and how fragile her mind had become. When I tried to move my mother, she snapped and growled at me like she was some animal, saying, "Don't touch me. I'm talking to him." I called my husband, and he met me over there, and we decided to call 911 because we didn't know what else to do. When they tried to take her to the hospital, she became extremely hostile and even violent. Not because we were taking her from her home, but because we were taking her from David. She kept saying that she wasn't allowed to leave because David wanted her there. The mind can truly conjure up anything when it's hurting, and my mother passed away not long after that night. God rest her soul. She never came back to herself after that night. Her half-open eyes and sleepwalking appearance never went back to normal. The doctors told me that she had some type of nervous breakdown, and due to her age, she couldn't separate reality from her mind. It really is so sad. When my biological father passed away, my mom was a wreck but buried those emotions to raise me. David saved her in so many ways, so when she lost him, it was like she lost nearly everything. I'm sorry if the story was a downer, but I'll never forget how my mother was acting that night. I'm a skeptical person, but a part of me almost believes that David was there with her. It's creepy, but the mind is an insane tool. Even just my mom thinking that the man was sitting with her freaks me out a little bit. Take care of yourself, folks, and tell your loved ones that you love them any chance you get. A few years back, in my early 20s, I lived for distance running. It was something I kind of fell into as a way of losing what my mom affectionately referred to as puppy fat. At first, I hated it with a passion, but after I started to see results, I kept at it until eventually, I think I was straight up addicted to what's called runner's high. After that, I signed up for my first race. It was just a little 5K fun run, and I didn't even place in the top 10. But after that, it became a part of my personality. I was that runner girl in my family as well as my circle of friends. I must have spent just shy of 1,000 pounds on specialist running shoes, ankle tape, knee supports, nipple tape, you name it. Running was something I'd be doing until I didn't have the breath in my lungs to carry me anymore. So, would you believe me if I told you I haven't been running in almost 3 years now? Personally, if you had told me in my prime that I'd just drop running one day, never to don my Lycra leggings ever again, I'd have called you a liar. But then again, if you had looked into a crystal ball and told me why, I think I'd have understood. To explain why, I have to tell you the story of a girl named Vanessa Marcotti. Vanessa was born in June of 1989 on the other side of the Atlantic in the U.S. state of Massachusetts. She went to the University of Boston, then went on to work for Google in New York City. From what I understand, Vanessa was happy, healthy, and successful, the daughter of two very proud parents. But in August of 2016, Vanessa went out for a run and never came back. Her body was found on a running trail in a forest not far from her home with burns on her face, feet, and hands. Her killer had choked her to death, broken her nose, then humiliated her after he'd taken her life. He also stole her clothes, her earbuds, and things like that. And he also left plenty of himself behind at the scene, if you catch my drift. According to the articles I read, Vanessa's injuries mostly came from having put up quite a lot of resistance during the attack. Her killer was so enraged by the fact that she actually hurt him back when she dared to put up a fight that he'd beaten her and burned her. The police arrested a guy for her murder, and I'm pretty sure the trial is yet to happen because I've got a Google alert set to notify me, and I've heard nothing about it so far. But that's not really why I'm telling you this story. The point is, Why did some random murder on the other side of the world stop me from doing something I love most in the world? You see, Vanessa was killed in her home county of Worcester, Massachusetts. I live in Worcester, England, and my name is Vanessa Marcotte. All that's different about our names is one little E. Vanessa was born in June of 1989, the exact same month and year as me, with her birthday being less than a week apart. Vanessa's parents are named John and Rosianna, and my parents are named Ross and Jean. Vanessa had brown hair and brown eyes, and yeah, you guessed it, I also have brown hair and brown eyes. You know the tired old cliche of my blood ran cold whenever a person sees something scary? It's true. It's exactly right. I remember feeling like I had ice in my veins as I read more and more about Vanessa's life and death. We were twins in more ways than one, more than twins in some ways. It was like we were the same person. I know that sounds mental, and I suppose to some of you it might sound like I'm trying to make this poor girl's murder all about me. There is such a thing as coincidences, after all. Only that's not what stopped me from running, not entirely. That happened almost a week later. As I've already touched on, I was freaked out by the other Vanessa's murder, but it wasn't enough to put me off running entirely. My route was open, in public, safe. But then I go out running one day, and my route is almost completely empty. It ran around the edge of quite a large park, with houses lining the entire route. There was always someone out there, be it a dog walker or another runner, sometimes even a sweet old couple enjoying an afternoon walk. But that time, my last time, it was completely deserted, all except for one man. Short hair, glasses, and a dark blue anorak. That much I remember about him. I saw him looking at me as I passed him on my first loop, but that's not entirely unusual. It's not nice, but wearing skin-tight clothes draws a lot of looks from the opposite gender, even if most are trying to be discreet about it. The way he looked at me was fairly creepy, but it didn't give me much cause for alarm. However, when it came to running my second loop of the park, I just couldn't do it. I know it must sound slightly crazy to the more rational of you, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that running that second loop and bumping into him again would be the end of me. I'd just end up like Vanessa, beaten, violated, mutilated. We were twins in more than one way. Our lives had been mirrored images in so many ways. I didn't want our deaths to be the same too. I gave it a week, told myself I'd give myself a break, then get back to running when I felt up to it again. Then a fortnight went by, and I still hadn't put my running shoes on. Then a fortnight became a month, and a month became half a year, and so on and so forth, until here I am, 3 years later, and I've never once gone running again. These days, I do a lot of burpees, then skipping rope when I want to save my knees. I'm thinking about investing in an exercise bike too, at least when I have the money to afford one. Anything but running, to be honest. Because part of me knows deep down that me and Vanessa's existences are mirror images, and as long as I stay away from my once beloved jogging, I'm going to live a long, happy life. Oh, I was sitting in my earth science class near the window, as I often did. I made it a point to get to all my classes early so I could get the best seat. That day, I would regret choosing to sit near the window, though, as it would turn into a day that I would never forget. So, I was just sitting there, doing my best to pay attention to the lesson when something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. I could have sworn that I saw something move near the tree line. When I looked again, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, so I just decided to go back to paying attention to the teacher. That was when I noticed it again, only this time when I looked, I noticed that there was a grown man standing beside one of the pine trees that lined the field. He was just standing there in what appeared to be dirt-covered clothing and a ski cap. I thought it was odd, so I raised my hand in hopes to bring it to the attention of my teacher. However, when we all turned to look out the window, there was no one there. The teacher told me to stop fooling around and just pay attention, so I did. I tried my best to wipe the entire experience from my mind. I finished out the school day and made my way home. I only lived about a half a mile from my high school, so I would usually walk home. I could have taken the bus if I wanted to, but I enjoyed the walk. I didn't enjoy it that day, though. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling like I was being watched. I tried my best not to be suspicious about it, but I slowly began increasing my walking speed. After what seemed like 10 times the usual distance, I finally made it home. As soon as my house was in sight, I sprinted across my lawn and into my front door. I locked the door behind me and began to fill my mom in on my experience. She was quick to write it off as just me being on edge and assured me that everything was fine. I tried my best to agree with her on that, but something in my gut wouldn't let me settle down. After a very long day, it had finally hit 10 p.m., and it was time for me to go to sleep. But sleep never came. Instead, I kept tossing and turning in my bed. I could swear that I still felt someone watching me. After a couple of hours passed, I had begun to drift off, when out of nowhere, I heard what sounded like scratching on the glass. I immediately turned to my window where I could swear I saw the edge of someone's shirt as they tucked themselves behind the wall. Before I could react, I heard my mom yelling for me. I leaped across my room and ran through my door, slamming it closed as I passed. When I made it to my mom's room, she told me to close the door. After I did, with no questions asked, she said, "Someone is outside of the house." My heart began to race. "The police are on the way, just stay in here." My mom pulled out her phone and opened up the security camera. The man wasn't there anymore, but on closer look, we could now see that my bedroom window had been opened. It wasn't long before the police arrived, though it felt like hours. By the time they got to my house, whoever it was had left. As I began to tell the police officers about the man I had seen at school earlier that day, he said that he and his partner would search the woods to see what they find. When they returned, I was horrified to find out they had found what they said was a homeless person's campsite. They said they also found a small journal with drawings in my classroom window, and on the last page, he had written, "It's time." To this day, no one knows who that man was or where he went. All I know is our dog has been sleeping in my room ever since. I've added punctuation to improve the readability of the text. If you have any further requests or need any more assistance, feel free to ask. I used to live in Port St. Lucie down here in Florida, and being something of a gun nut, I'd make weekly visits to a place called the OK Corral Gun Club over in Okeechobee. For a long time, the OKCG was just about my favorite place in the world. I could shoot off a few rounds, then head over to the club's restaurant for what I swear is the best turkey club I've ever tasted. Some of my fondest memories are from the OKCG, and since I took clients there on occasion to close deals, I'd like to think my membership fee paid for itself. But that membership ended on November 17th, 2017, when it was revoked by the club over an accident that occurred on one of the rifle ranges. It was an accident that I've never been able to fully explain, and one that almost ended one of the most enduring friendships of my life. Myself and Roger, my supposed victim in the story, arrived at the OKC just after 8 in the morning. Definitely not our usual time, but since I had to take my kid to a Little League game later that morning, it was just about the only slot that we could fit a shoot in. I packed my custom M1, a World War II classic with a modern twist that I'm still very much in love with. I had the metal parts parkerized with manganese phosphate, meaning you'd need a diamond cutter to put a scratch in it. And with a walnut handguard that I had fitted, it really is a thing of beauty. I also had the muzzle recrowned, and the front and rear sights replaced with National Match standard parts. The result was that I could shoot the butt off a fly at 300 yards. I mean, any pro shooter in the country would have been happy to use that rifle. And I haven't touched it in just over 4 years now, and that's because it's the rifle that almost killed my best friend. I remember it was kind of chilly that morning. Well, about as chilly as you're ever likely to get in Central Florida. Me and Roger got ourselves some takeout coffee from the club's cafe, shouldered our gear, and headed down to one of the ranges. After that, we started off our usual ritual of blowing off steam in more ways than one. We complain about our wives, our kids, and our clients, and each bullet was like a little piece of tension just flying downrange. I swear sometimes we'd leave with this sin feeling of absolute calm, having unloaded both our consciences and our mags in one sitting. But that time, when it came to my third or fourth mag, something weird started to happen. It started with one missed shot, then 2, then 3. And remember, this is one of the most accurate rifles on the planet. Roger shouted over to me, saying something like, "They say the eyes are the first to go in old age, but Jesus, dude, you're shooting like a drunk stormtrooper this morning." I didn't even give him so much as a grunt in response. I was way too concentrated on identifying whatever was wrong with my beloved custom. So, as you can imagine, I started troubleshooting. I cleared the chamber, checked the ammo I was using, working my way through a little mental checklist. When all of a sudden, I hear, "What the hell?" I look up, and Roger is staring at something downrange. Then he starts moving his neck back and forth, like a person does when they're trying to look at something from a slightly different angle. Before I can ask him what's giving him the willies, he does something that you should never, ever do at a gun club. He starts walking downrange towards the target. The rifle range had about 20 lanes on it back then, even more now, so I heard. And since it was so early in the morning on a weekend, there was only one other lane in use by a single other shooter. When Roger started to walk downrange, I look over to the other shooter, who's in a similar state of shock as I was. I remember hissing something like, "What's wrong with you, man?" But he didn't even look back for a second. I tried for a second time to see what he was so transfixed by, and then I saw it, or rather, I caught a little glimpse of him. It was only when the sun broke from behind a cloud, casting a few rays of late fall sun onto something that glinted in the light. It was only then that I had a better idea of what I was looking at. I just had to wait for Roger to confirm it. As he got closer and closer, I called out to him, asking if he was looking at what I thought he was looking at. When he replied, I started to walk downrange too, just to make sure I wasn't going totally crazy. Lo and behold, hanging there in midair, like they were stuck in some invisible wall, were 3 of my .30-06. I remember stopping dead in my tracks before instinctively backing away from them a few steps. I've never felt that kind of fear before, the kind when you're looking at something that just does not compute. Meanwhile, Roger is still just staring at the bullets, eyes all wide, mouth slightly opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was trying to find the words and was failing every time. Even though we were in a complete state of shock, completely absorbed by the raw curiosity of what we were seeing, at no point did Roger step in front of the floating bullets. I guess once you've got that muscle memory and gun safety drilled into you, even something as insane as that can't make you neglect it. That's the thing I had a hard time explaining to folks afterward. Stuff already didn't make sense, but what happened next was somehow even more bizarre and terrifying than the floating bullets. When I finally got my train of thought back, the first thing that occurred to me was to take a picture of what we were looking at. I knew none of them would believe me. I mean, people still don't. And if I'd managed to get that picture, then it would have saved me a mountain of trouble afterward. So, as I got my phone out, I heard this faint, almost tinny noise, like the sound you hear after you hear a loud bang or whatever. I look up, and I swear to God, the bullets were vibrating. Not a lot, but they were definitely trembling very subtly in midair. I took another few steps back, not sure of exactly what was going to happen, but knowing enough to know it wouldn't be good. Roger did the same, turning a whiter shade of pale as he moved to his left to get even further away from the bullets. I have to make this clear for a third time now because at no point did he stand in front of the rounds. He remained, as I was looking at it, to the right of the bullets, facing me and them the whole time. Then, right as the tinny noise reached its peak, I heard this supersonic crack and the bullets were gone. I remember looking over at Roger, like, oh my God, did you see that? Roger just looked at me, same wide eyes as before, then put a hand to his shoulder. When he brought it away, there was blood on his fingers, and that's when he collapsed. I guess you can all figure what happened next. There was screaming, shouting, 911 was called. Roger was rushed to the ER, and as a precaution, I was detained by the cops. I was worried, sure. I mean, I'd never even been arrested before, let alone for shooting someone. But all it took was Roger insisting that he didn't want to press charges, how it had all been a horrible accident, and I was released. That all changed once Roger told the cops what happened. They got it into their heads that something was going on, as in, I must have intimidated him into coming up with some crazy story to distract from the fact that I shot him. Somehow, it didn't matter that he walked downrange. In fact, it was probably me that forced Roger to walk down there in the first place. After all, once Roger's now ex-wife got in his head, that's when the real trouble came. She convinced him that all the floating bullet stuff couldn't have possibly happened, but the only logical thing was that his best friend in the world had just up and shot him for no good reason whatsoever. It didn't matter that he'd seen all the same stuff as me. It didn't matter that he wasn't even standing in the path of the bullets. All that mattered was that someone had to take the blame, and for a long time, that person was me. Like I said, it was all that stuff that almost ended our friendship. I know he was a mess around that time, emotionally and physically, and we've since put all that behind us. But his ex got all up in his head, told him what he saw was impossible, that it was all his way of rationalizing that his best bud had tried to murder him. It took until the cops got their hands on the security camera footage. Thank God for that, for them to actually drop the case against me. I mean, they knew something had happened, something real messed up, but it wasn't anything they could charge me for. Especially since it was clear that Roger had walked down the range of his own volition. After that, it was just a case of me and Roger patching things up. I'd rather not go into the whole divorce thing he went through. It was pretty upsetting for everyone involved, and I don't really feel like it's my story to tell. But needless to say, we had a pretty emotional reunion not long after he filed the papers. We're still close, real close, the kind of close you can only really get when you go through something truly terrifying. I know there's a scientific explanation for what happened to us that day. There has to be. I just think it's one that science hasn't quite reached yet. Maybe there will come a time when all sorts of things are easily explained through science or metaphysics, as Roger has taken to calling it. It's just a shame it's not now because, let me tell you, it would have saved me and my best friend a whole world of trouble. Thank you. Oh, I've always been interested in the paranormal and witnessed and experienced some events that I can't explain to this day. But I'm a very rational person, so I always brushed it off while keeping an open mind, of course. One of these experiences left me with no doubt. My current girlfriend used to work at a cafe bakery in an old building in Bordeaux. She used to close at night alone because she was the store manager and stayed after the crew was done to count the register, do all the paperwork, etc. The bakery consisted of the storefront, the kitchen in the back, and the office in the back as well. There's also a second floor which is only storage and the changing rooms for the staff. The building isn't shared, it was only the cafe bakery. She told me she felt uneasy as soon as her first shift there. Most nights, she'd hear running footsteps upstairs, the TVs in the sitting area for the customers turning off and on randomly, and the front door's doorbell ringing while the door was not moving, all that when she was alone. Another coworker she was close with shared the same experiences with her. I believed her because she has a history of paranormal encounters and is very serious about that stuff, but I wasn't convinced until I witnessed it. I also worked in the food industry, so I was rarely off when she was working too. One Sunday, I was off, so I decided to come pick her up and spent the last 30 to 45 minutes of her workday, which she usually spends alone. This time, she gave me a tour of the place, and it did feel uneasy, but nothing significant happened except for some rattling noises upstairs. Until I mentioned how quiet her ghosts, the bakery was. She was counting the register in the office in the back of the store. I was leaning against the wall in the corridor leading to the office. My back was turned away from the storefront. To my right, there was the dishwashing room. There was no door to this room, just an opening in the corridor. To better visualize, I was facing towards the office, watching my girlfriend, turning my back to the storefront. Leaning against the wall, but seeing the dishwashing room in my peripheral vision. Jokingly, I told her, "I'm glad your ghost decided to leave us alone tonight." Not 1 second after I finished my sentence, the pile of glasses and dishes in the dishwashing room went flying. I saw the whole room clearly in my side vision, and there was no wind, nothing that could have done that. There was a pile of glasses stacked up in a pyramid, and they flew as if someone ran their hand through the base. It wasn't one glass slipping and bringing down the pyramid, it was legitimately pushed off. She just told me, "I told you he's always there." Since she's used to stuff like that happening, we stayed less than 10 minutes in there, but I could feel a different level of oppression and uneasiness the whole time. This one sticks with me because there's no rational explanation. I saw the dishes go flying around, and it was a direct response to my joke. I have no other experiences that could be explained. I'd be happy to post them if you want to find an explanation or lack of. I've had a lot of paranormal stuff, but the one I just told is just outright the weirdest. I am a moderately typical teenager from Japan. I'm male, and ever since I can remember, I have throughout my lifetime had recurring encounters with some strange people, be it in terms of looks or behavior. These encounters can happen anywhere from a week's space to several months, and it always seems like when I do, it was their intention to meet me. My most recent one was on my way home from school. During my walk, I was looking down at my phone for a short moment, about to text one of my friends that I had planned to have over at my house later. As I looked up, a young man looking like he was in his 20s was approaching me a few meters ahead. This confused me for a minute, as it was a straight and fairly long path ahead. I thought to myself that while I may have been looking at my phone, I would surely have noticed him coming from the corner of the path, a good length away, or at least I expected him to be closer to that corner. But there he was, approaching from the middle as if he had appeared from thin air. His hair was dark brown, a bit unkempt but still good looking, and he had green eyes. His clothes were fairly ordinary, too, keeping a sort of laid-back summer style to it. The most remarkable thing about him was his tattoo or mark per se, a black line running from his left chin and down underneath his shirt. As he got closer enough for conversation, he stopped me and asked for my name. When I told him, he said that he had heard about me before. This confused me, as I'm not exactly a celebrity, but I thought nothing more of it. We then had some boring small talk, but he genuinely seemed pretty cheerful. Just as he was about to take off, he told me that I should probably wait for my friend. He didn't give me much of a chance to respond to this before walking off in the direction he came from. I thought about what he said and turned around to walk back to school. I glanced behind my back not long after, only to find that he was nowhere to be seen. As I made it back to my school, I sure enough found my friend waiting by the gate. She apparently thought that we were going to walk to my place together and had been waiting for me for quite a long time. I apologized, and we began walking, and well, that's the end of it. I didn't tell her about the encounter, but I thought about it. When she left, I didn't tell him or hint about my friend at all, so how would he have known? These types of encounters have kept on happening throughout my whole life. Sometimes very frequently, and I don't know why these people I meet just seem too unreal and usually know something I never told them about, which leads me to believe that maybe these people aren't human after all. This was in 2014 or 15. My girlfriend and I were staying in a hotel called Stay on Main. I only learned later about the hotel's history. I only stayed there because it was cheap. That place was incredibly freaky, but anyway, I digress. My girlfriend and I were walking to a parking structure where our car was because we planned on going to Disneyland. As we were walking there, my girlfriend noticed a shortcut to the car down an alley. My instincts told me, no, let's just walk around since it's a nice day outside. Anyway, she insisted, and I said, screw it, let's go. As soon as we turned into the alley, I noticed right away that a man in a hoodie quickly turned and followed us down the alley. As soon as we went, I told my girlfriend out of my breath, don't freak out, but we're being followed. I told her to run and get help while I fight him off. As we started to pick up our pace to create some distance from him, I noticed that this alley is a dead end. There's no way out but to go back from where we came. This man was closing his distance on us, had his hands in his hoodie pocket by the belly. I made a fist with my keys as I turned around to face him, ready to fight. As we passed a dumpster, swear to God, guys, 2 men in perfect business suits with briefcases said, "Good morning," and passed us, walking very fast. They popped up out of nowhere. They had black sunglasses on, were white and tall, at least 6 feet tall. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't give them the greeting of the day back. I was just in shock. This man that was following us had turned around and sprinted out of the alleyway, which really showed me his true intentions. My girlfriend and I followed the 2 suited men out of the alley back to the public streets, but they were nowhere to be seen. But then, we somehow lost the 2 men in suits. I swear to God they saved my life and my girlfriend's, my now wife. I'm convinced that they were angels who protected us from a potential tragedy. I still give my wife guff till this day about taking that shortcut through the alley.
I'm an icon, man. I'm a girl about a 10. I should fuck her in a Benz.